The clock on Marcus Thompson's dashboard read 9:47 p.m. as he navigated his Mercedes S-Class through the quiet streets of Georgetown. Another late night at the J. Edgar Hoover building, though as FBI director, late nights had become his new normal. His wife Catherine had texted earlier about leaving his dinner in the warming drawer her famous pot roast, the same meal she'd made the night he was confirmed as the first black director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The memory of his confirmation hearing brought a slight smile to his face. His father, at 82, had sat in the front row, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he watched his son make history. "From walking with Dr. King to seeing my boy lead the FBI," he'd whispered afterward, gripping Marcus's hand. "The arc of history bends toward justice." Thompson adjusted his rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of his own face, the grey peppered throughout his short-cropped hair, crow's feet etched around his eyes from 23 years of service to his country. At 52, he'd achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of, and then some. The day's meetings replayed in his mind: budget allocations, counterterrorism briefings, a new human trafficking task force he was particularly passionate about. The flash of red and blue lights in his mirror scattered his thoughts. Thompson glanced at his speedometer: 42 in a 35. He'd been distracted, certainly, but nothing serious. With practiced ease, he signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning his Mercedes carefully. Interior lights on, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, engine off. Standard procedure, though he'd never needed it himself. The cruiser's spotlight bathed his car in harsh white light. Thompson watched in his side mirror as the officer approached, hand resting on his holstered weapon. Something about the officer's stance made Thompson's neck tighten. "License and registration," the officer barked, his flashlight beam sweeping aggressively across the car's interior. Young voice, Thompson noted. Nervous energy. "Good evening," Officer Thompson replied calmly. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for it now, if that's all right." The officer didn't respond, just kept the flashlight beam steady. Thompson moved slowly, telegraphing each movement as he retrieved his registration and license. "Step out of the vehicle." Thompson's pulse quickened, but his voice remained steady. "May I ask why, officer? I was only slightly over the speed limit." I said, "Step out of the vehicle now." The officer's voice cracked like a whip. As Thompson reached for his door handle, he heard the distinctive sound of more sirens approaching. 2 additional patrol cars screeched to a halt behind him, their lights painting the quiet Georgetown street in alternating red and blue. 4 officers emerged, weapons drawn, hands where we can see them. "Get on your knees." Thompson's mind raced through protocols and procedures both as law enforcement and as a black man in America. His father's voice echoed in his memory sometimes: "Son, being right isn't enough. You have to be alive to fight the battle." "Officers," he said clearly, hands raised, "I want to comply with all your commands, but I need you to know that I'm Marcus Thompson, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My credentials are in my breast pocket." A harsh laugh from one of the officers. "Sure you are, buddy, and I'm the Tooth Fairy. On your knees." Thompson slowly knelt, feeling the bite of gravel through his bespoke suit pants. The original officer approached, weapon trained center mass, while another roughly grabbed his arms, wrenching them behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into his wrists. "My credentials," Thompson began. "Shut up," the first officer snapped. "We've got a black male in an expensive vehicle, possibly stolen, resisting officer's commands." Thompson took a deep breath, forcing his voice to remain calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this is a mistake that's going to have serious repercussions. Please, check my credentials." The first officer holstered his weapon and roughly patted Thompson down, finally reaching into his jacket pocket. The FBI credentials emerged, gold badge gleaming in the strobing police lights. Silence descended like a heavy curtain. "Oh shit," one of the younger officers whispered. Thompson remained on his knees, hands cuffed behind his back, as the reality of who he was slowly penetrated the officer's consciousness. In that moment, he wasn't thinking about the political fallout or tomorrow's headlines. He was thinking about his father marching in Selma, about his own son away at college, about every black man who'd ever found himself in this position without the protection of a gold badge. "I'd appreciate it if you'd remove these handcuffs," Thompson said quietly. "Then we can discuss how we're going to handle this situation." The original officer's hand trembled slightly as he unlocked the cuffs. As Thompson rose to his feet, brushing gravel from his knees, he saw phones in nearby windows, their cameras capturing everything. By morning, this would be everywhere. His job, his position, his carefully built influence, all of it, would be tested by what had just happened. But maybe, just maybe, that was exactly why it needed to happen to him. By 6 a.m., Marcus Thompson's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The dashcam footage had leaked online around midnight, and every major news network was running it on a loop. The FBI director on his knees, hands cuffed behind his back, while officers trained their weapons on him. The cell phone videos from nearby residents added additional angles, including crystal clear audio of Thompson calmly identifying himself, only to be mocked and dismissed. "Sir, the Attorney General is on line 1," his assistant Sarah said, her voice tense through the speaker. "CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News are all requesting immediate statements. The President's Chief of Staff has called 3 times. Thompson sat in his home office, watching the footage play across multiple screens. Catherine stood behind him, her hands resting supportively on his shoulders. "They need to hear from you," she said softly. "But on your terms." His phone buzzed again, a text from his son Marcus Jr. at Howard University. "Dad, my whole dorm is watching. You okay? Want me to come home?" Thompson typed back quickly, "Stay focused on your studies." "I'm fine. Love you." But he wasn't fine. The comment sections on social media were battlegrounds. Half the country saw the incident as definitive proof of systemic racism. If even the FBI director could be treated this way, what chance did ordinary citizens have? The other half scrambled to justify the officer's actions. He was speeding. It was dark. They couldn't verify his identity immediately. Some even suggested he should have known better than to drive an expensive car in that neighborhood. Fox News ran the headline, "FBI Director's Traffic Stop Political Stunt or Legitimate Concern." MSNBC countered with top law enforcement official experiences what Black America lives with daily. At 9 a.m., Georgetown Police Department held a hasty press conference. Chief Sandra Martinez looked uncomfortable as she addressed the cameras. "We are conducting a thorough internal investigation into last night's incident involving FBI Director Thompson. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending." Her words were drowned out by shouts from the assembled press corps. Behind her, the mayor shifted nervously. Thompson's phone rang again. This time it was Reverend James Winston, the aging civil rights leader who'd mentored him since college. "Marcus, you need to speak out. Not just for yourself, but for every black man and woman who's ever been profiled, harassed, or worse. You have a platform now, use it." By noon, protesters had gathered outside both FBI headquarters and the Georgetown Police Department. Signs read "Black Lives Matter" and "Even a badge won't protect us." Counter-protesters showed up too, waving thin blue-line flags and chanting support for law enforcement. Inside the Hoover building, Thompson met with his senior staff. Deputy Director Caroline Hayes, his longtime friend and ally, closed the door behind the last participant. "They're going to try to force you out," she said bluntly. "I'm already hearing whispers from the Hill. They'll say you're too controversial now, that you can't effectively lead the Bureau while being at the center of this kind of political storm." Thompson loosened his ties slightly, and if they succeed, they'll have proved exactly what this incident exposed, that no amount of authority or accomplishment can fully protect us from systemic bias. His phone lit up with a text from the Attorney General. "Need public statement ASAP. WH very concerned about optics." At 3 p.m., Thompson stood before a forest of microphones in the FBI press room. Cameras clicked rapidly as he adjusted his papers. The room fell silent. "Last night I experienced something that millions of Americans live with as a daily reality," he began, his deep voice steady. "I was profiled, detained at gunpoint, and handcuffed despite identifying myself as the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Some will attempt to justify this incident. Others will attempt to use it for political gain. I'm here to do neither." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "Instead, I want to focus on what this moment reveals about our ongoing struggle for equal justice under law. As FBI director, I have access to privileges and protections that many citizens do not. Yet even those privileges proved insufficient in the face of deeply ingrained biases and assumptions. This is not about a single traffic stop, or even about me. This is about a systemic issue that demands systemic solutions. Social media erupted. Civil rights leaders praised his measured response while calling for concrete action. Police unions issued carefully worded statements about officer safety and split-second decisions. Political commentators debated whether Thompson could survive the controversy. By evening, Reverend Winston had organized a coalition of civil rights organizations to support Thompson. They held a candlelight vigil outside the FBI building, singing "We Shall Overcome" as news cameras rolled. The officers involved hired lawyers and released a joint statement expressing regret for any misunderstanding while defending their actions as consistent with department policy for high-risk stops. Thompson's father called from Atlanta. "You remember what Dr. King said about the arc of history?" he asked. "Bends toward justice," Thompson replied. "That bend ain't natural, son. People like you have to do the bending." Later that night, as Thompson finally prepared for bed, Catherine handed him a cup of tea. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He stood at their bedroom window, looking out at the news vans still parked along their street. "I'm thinking about Marcus Jr. and all the young people watching this unfold. If I handle this right, maybe their world will be a little different. If I handle it wrong..." "You won't," Catherine said firmly. "You've spent your whole life preparing for this moment, even if you didn't know it." His phone buzzed one final time, a message from Deputy Director Hayes. "Heads up. Oversight Committee wants you to testify next week. This is just the beginning." Thompson put down his tea and picked up his briefing folder for tomorrow. If this was just the beginning, he needed to be ready, because sometimes he realized the most important battles find you when you least expect them. 3 weeks after the incident, FBI Deputy Director Caroline Hayes placed a thick folder on Thompson's desk. "You need to see this," she said, her expression grim. The folder contained background checks on the 4 officers involved in his traffic stop. Officer James Miller, the one who'd initially pulled him over, had 6 civilian complaints of racial bias in his 3 years on the force. All dismissed. Officer Stephen Brooks had been named in 2 excessive force lawsuits, both settled out of court with sealed records. "There's more," Hayes continued, pulling up data on her tablet. "We've identified a pattern. Over the past 2 years, these officers conducted random traffic stops that targeted minority drivers at 4 times the rate of their colleagues. They focused particularly on expensive vehicles." Thompson leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. "They were hunting," he said quietly. His personal email pinged another anonymous message: "Race traitor. Resign or else." He'd been getting dozens daily since launching the investigation. Catherine had already deleted their home phone number after the constant threatening calls. The doorbell camera at their house had caught 2 men photographing their property at 3 a.m. last night. Marcus Jr. had been followed on his college campus by journalists asking about his father's agenda. "The Georgetown PD internal investigation is a joke," Hayes continued. "They're trying to bury it. But here's what they don't know: we found body cam footage from other incidents. Same officers, same pattern. They even joked about it over their radios, called it fishing for luxury." Thompson stood and walked to his office window, looking out over Washington. 23 years in the bureau, and he'd never felt so isolated. Half his political allies had stopped taking his calls. The police unions were painting him as an enemy of law enforcement. Conservative media questioned his loyalty to the badge. So Hayes said, "This goes beyond those 4 officers. The department's leadership had to know. The pattern is too clear, the complaints too consistent." But Thompson nodded slowly. "Draft a proposal for a new FBI initiative. I want a nationwide investigation into systemic profiling practices, data analysis, pattern recognition, full audit of civilian complaints. If this is happening in Georgetown..." "It's happening everywhere," Hayes finished. "But sir, if we do this, they'll come for your job." Thompson turned back to his desk, picking up a framed photo of his father at the march on Washington. "They're already coming for my job, Caroline. Might as well give them a real reason." That evening he sat with Catherine in their kitchen, picking at dinner, while the news played quietly in the background. A pundit was questioning his ability to remain objective given his personal vendetta against law enforcement. "Marcus," Catherine said softly, "we got another letter today. They know where Marcus Jr. lives on campus." Thompson felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. His son had called yesterday, trying to sound casual about the white van that kept parking outside his dorm. His father had started receiving visitors at his retirement community, concerned citizens, asking about his son's loyalty to America. His phone buzzed Deputy Director Hayes again. Georgetown Police Union just released a statement. They're claiming you ran a stop sign before the traffic stop. No evidence, but Fox News is running with it. Thompson walked to his home office and opened his laptop. The FBI initiative proposal was already there, waiting for his signature. It would authorize the most comprehensive investigation into police profiling practices in U.S. history. It would also, he knew, probably end his career. As he reached for his digital signature pad, he remembered something his father used to say: change doesn't come from comfortable people making comfortable choices. The next morning, Thompson called a press conference. No notes, no prepared statement, just the truth. We have uncovered evidence of systematic racial profiling within the Georgetown Police Department, he announced to the stunned room. But more importantly, we have reason to believe this is not an isolated incident. Therefore, I am launching a nationwide FBI initiative to investigate similar patterns of behavior in law enforcement agencies across the country. The room erupted. Through the chaos of shouted questions, Thompson continued, I understand the personal and professional risks of this decision. I also understand that my position gives me a unique responsibility. If not me, then who? If not now, then when? When? By that evening, Thompson Must Go was trending on social media. His security detail had doubled after credible threats. But for the first time since the traffic stop, he felt at peace with what was coming. His son called. Dad, I'm proud of you. Thompson smiled, even as he noticed another white van driving slowly past his house. Thanks, son. Stay safe at school. You too, Dad. And Dad, make them remember why they feared giving us power in the first place. Thompson ended the call and turned back to his computer. He had work to do for however long they let him do it. The Attorney General's office had excellent coffee, Thompson noted absently, staring at his untouched cup. Outside the mahogany-paneled conference room, Washington continued its endless dance of power and politics. Inside, his future hung by a thread. Marcus. Bay. The aide said, using his first name for perhaps the first time in their long professional relationship, you've started something we can't control. The police unions are threatening nationwide slowdowns. 3 senators have privately suggested impeachment proceedings. The president is concerned. Thompson placed his cup carefully on its saucer. Concerned about racism in law enforcement or concerned about the political fallout? The AG's silence was answer enough. The Bureau cannot effectively function under this level of controversy, Assistant Attorney General Richardson chimed in. Sources say half the police departments in the country are refusing to cooperate with FBI investigations. Your presence has become a liability to the very institution you're trying to protect. Back in his office, Thompson found a delegation waiting. 20 senior agents, led by his old friend and mentor, Special Agent Jim McCarthy. But we're with you, Sir, McCarthy said simply. The rank and file understand what you're doing and why it matters. Whatever happens, we've got your back. Thompson's phone buzzed another text from Deputy Director Hayes. They're drafting the announcement of your resignation. But they haven't written it yet because they don't have it. He smiled slightly. Not yet. That afternoon, a different group arrived. 3 senior senators, 2 from his own party. The kind of meeting that didn't appear on official schedules. You've made your point, Marcus. Senator Elizabeth Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. You've started an important conversation, but now it's time to think about the bigger picture. Resign now on your own terms and you can lead the conversation from the outside. Wait too long, and they'll destroy me, Thompson finished. Make me radioactive. Ensure no one remembers what started this, only how it ended. Senator Chen nodded sadly. That evening, Thompson walked the halls of the Hoover building alone. Junior agents snapped to attention as he passed, many offering quiet words of support. His phone kept buzzing media inquiries, political operatives, civil rights leaders offering sanctuary, but he ignored them all. In the pre-dawn hours, he sat in his office drafting 2 documents. The first, a detailed report on systemic bias in law enforcement, complete with data, witness statements, and policy recommendations. The second, shorter but infinitely heavier, his resignation. Catherine called. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you. But Marcus, make sure you can live with it." He thought about his father's stories of the civil rights movement, about his son's future, about every black man and woman who'd ever been profiled, harassed, or worse, about power and what it was really for. At 9 a.m., Thompson called an all-hands meeting in the FBI auditorium. No press, no cameras, just him and his people. "When I took this job," he began, looking out over the sea of faces, "I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect the American people. All of the American people. That oath didn't come with an expiration date or a political convenience clause." The room was absolutely silent. "I've been asked to resign. They say it's for the good of the Bureau. They say I've become a distraction from our mission. But I believe our mission includes confronting uncomfortable truths about justice in America." He paused, looking down at the two documents in his hands. "I could resign. Launch a foundation, write a book, give speeches about change from the outside. It would be easier for me, for the Bureau, for the bureaucratic establishment. But easy choices don't create change." Thompson held up his resignation letter, then deliberately tore it in half. The sound echoed through the silent auditorium. "I will not resign. I will not be forced out for doing exactly what this position requires, pursuing justice without fear or favor. If they want me out, they'll have to fire me. And if they do, I want every one of you to remember why." The auditorium erupted in applause. Agents stood, many with tears in their eyes. Thompson saw McCarthy in the back, nodding slowly. His phone buzzed one final time, a message from his son. "Dad, my constitutional law professor just said something interesting. Sometimes keeping your job isn't as important as doing your job." Thompson smiled, tucked his phone away, and walked back to his office. He had work to do for however long they let him do it. And if they wanted his badge, they'd have to take it along with the truth he'd exposed. The next morning's headlines would be brutal. The political pressure would intensify. But for the first time since this all began, Marcus Thompson slept soundly. Sometimes, keeping your power isn't as important as using it right. 6 months after refusing to resign, Marcus Thompson sat in a different office, watching President Harris sign the Law Enforcement Accountability and Professional Standards Act. The bill, already known as Thompson's Law, represented the most significant police reform legislation in decades. They'd fired him, of course. 3 weeks after his refusal to resign, citing loss of confidence from law enforcement partners, but by then, the movement he'd sparked had grown beyond their control. The Georgetown Police Department had become ground zero for reform. Chief Martinez resigned under pressure, and an independent audit revealed decades of systematic profiling. The 4 officers involved in Thompson's stop were terminated, their records triggering reviews of hundreds of past arrests. Mr. Thompson, a young reporter, called out after the signing ceremony, "How does it feel to see your personal tragedy transform into national policy?" Thompson straightened his tie, no longer FBI standard issue, but still impeccable. "This was never about my experience alone. It was about using that moment to expose a larger truth that too many Americans already knew." The legislation mandated body cameras, created civilian oversight boards with real power, and required transparent reporting of traffic stop demographics. But more importantly, it had sparked a genuine national conversation about policing and race. His phone buzzed a text from Marcus Jr., now in his final year of law school, watching the signing. "Dad, you did it." Thompson smiled, remembering their conversation the day after his firing. "Maybe this is what you were meant to do all along," his son had said. "Sometimes you have to lose power to make real change." The civil rights speaking circuit wasn't what he'd planned for his career, but it felt right. Last week, he'd addressed a joint session of Congress. Tomorrow, he'd be teaching at the FBI Academy. They'd invited him back to help shape the next generation of agents. The most significant change, Thompson told the assembled press, isn't in the legislation. It's in the conversations happening in police academies, in precinct houses, in communities across America. We're finally having honest discussions about bias, about power, about responsibility. His old friend Caroline Hayes, now FBI director herself, had implemented many of his recommended reforms. The Bureau's new Civil Rights Enforcement Division, created in the wake of his firing, was actively investigating departments nationwide. The Georgetown incident had become a mandatory case study in police training. Officers learn not just what went wrong, but why and how their own biases could blind them to the humanity of the people they encountered. Later that evening, Thompson spoke at a community center in Southeast D.C. The audience included young black men, veteran civil rights activists, and increasingly police officers committed to change. They thought firing me would end the conversation, he told them. Instead, it amplified it. Because the truth doesn't need a badge to be heard. It just needs people willing to speak it, and people willing to listen. His father, now in his wheelchair but still sharp as ever, sat in the front row. The arc bends, he whispered as Thompson passed, but only if we keep pushing. The data was starting to show results. Traffic stop disparities had dropped significantly in departments implementing the new standards. Civilian complaints were down. Trust was slowly, painfully being rebuilt. After the speech, a young black police officer approached him. "Sir, I joined the force because of you. Because you showed us we don't have to choose between our identity and our badge." Thompson's phone buzzed again, Deputy Director Hayes sharing new statistics. The FBI's Civil Rights Division had opened investigations into 15 departments this month alone. Change was happening, not as fast as some wanted, but faster than many had thought possible. "Your reputation has been vindicated," his lawyer had said last week, reviewing the latest polls. But Thompson wasn't interested in vindication. "This was never about clearing my name," he replied. "It was about making sure no one else's name would be added to the list of those profiled, harassed, or worse." Well, that night, having dinner with Catherine and Marcus Jr., Thompson reflected on the journey. He'd lost his dream job but found his true calling. The FBI director's badge was locked away in his study, a reminder that sometimes the price of progress is everything you thought you wanted. "I'm thinking about writing a book," he told them. "Not about what happened to me, but about what happened after. About how change really happens." Marcus Jr. smiled. "Call it the price of truth." Thompson's phone lit up one last time. A message from Reverend Winston watched the bill signing. Dr. King would be proud. But he'd also say the work isn't finished. Thompson looked at his family, thought about the young officers he'd be teaching tomorrow, the communities starting to see real change, the conversations finally happening in precincts and parliaments across the country. "No," he said quietly, "the work isn't finished. But maybe now we've got a real chance to do it right." Outside, the city was quiet. Somewhere, other traffic stops were happening. But tonight, they were more likely to end justly because one man had chosen truth over power, and found that truth was the greater power after all.